You holding up all right?
It's just the wind. It never stops.
We'll get through it.
The desert wind carried secrets across the red dust of Monument Valley, where desperate souls came to die or be reborn. Emily Morrison had ridden 3 days through unforgiving heat, her horse nearly collapsing beneath her when she finally saw the weathered cabin rising from the scrub brush like a mirage. The wooden structure stood defiant against the endless horizon, smoke curling from its chimney into the bruised evening sky. This was her last hope. She had heard the stories whispered in saloons and general stores across 3 territories. Jake Ironhand Callahan, a man who feared nothing, trusted no one, and answered to nobody. Some said he was an outlaw turned straight. Others claimed he was a gunfighter who'd grown tired of killing. All agreed on one thing. He was the only man in the territory who could stand against the land barons and live to tell about it. Emily's hands trembled as she dismounted, her legs barely supporting her weight after days in the saddle. Her once beautiful blue dress hung in tatters, stained with dust and desperation. Dark circles shadowed her green eyes, but her jaw remained set with the kind of determination that only comes from having nothing left to lose. Behind her, the setting sun painted the canyon walls in shades of fire and blood. Fitting, considering the war that had brought her here. 3 weeks ago, she had been Emily Preston, wife of a small-time rancher with big dreams. Now she was a widow with a price on her head and gunmen hunting her trail. The Blackstone Cattle Company had made their intentions clear. Surrender the deed to her late husband's water rights or join him in the ground. But Emily had discovered something that made those water rights more valuable than anyone realized, including the Blackstone men who had put a bullet in her husband's back. The cabin door creaked open, and Emily's breath caught in her throat. Jake Callahan emerged from the shadows like something carved from the desert itself. Tall and broad-shouldered with hands that looked like they could break a man's neck or gentle a wild horse with equal ease. His dark eyes swept over her with the calculating gaze of a predator assessing potential prey. A week's worth of stubble covered his angular jaw, and his leather vest bore the scars of 100 fights. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind whistled through the canyon, carrying the distant cry of a hawk. Emily felt every mile she had traveled, every tear she had shed, every prayer she had whispered, settling into the single moment of truth. She had come here because she had no choice. But looking into Jake Callahan's eyes, she wondered if she had simply traded one death sentence for another. "You lost, lady." His voice was like gravel mixed with whiskey, rough but not unkind. Emily straightened her spine, calling upon reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed. This man was her last chance, her only chance, and she would not waste it. Emily's throat felt like sandpaper, but she forced herself to speak. "Mr. Callahan, I need your help." Jake's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his dark eyes. He leaned against the door frame, arms crossed, making no move to invite her inside. "Help's a dangerous word out here, ma'am. Usually gets folks killed." "They've already killed my husband." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "The Blackstone Company. They shot Samuel in the back like a dog, and now they want me to sign over our land. But I can't. I won't." Jake studied her for a long moment, his gaze taking in every detail. The torn dress, the exhausted horse, the desperate gleam in her eyes that spoke of a woman with nothing left to lose. He'd seen that look before, usually right before someone did something spectacularly stupid. "Blackstone, huh?" He pushed off from the door frame but didn't step aside. "They're not exactly known for taking no for an answer. What makes you think I'd won any part of that particular war?" Emily's heart hammered against her ribs. She had prepared for this moment, rehearsed what she would say. But standing here under his piercing stare, all her carefully planned words crumbled to dust. "Because they're coming for you next." That got his attention. Jake's eyes sharpened, and for the first time she saw genuine interest flicker across his features. "Is that a fact? I overheard them talking." Emily stepped closer, lowering her voice, even though they were alone in the vast emptiness. "After they take my land, they plan to move on yours. They need the whole valley for some kind of railroad deal. You're standing in the way of a lot of money, Mr. Callahan." Jake was quiet for so long that Emily began to wonder if he'd heard her at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a dangerous edge. Money makes men do stupid things. Doesn't mean I have to care about their stupidity. Desperation clawed at Emily's chest. She had ridden 3 days to find this man had pinned all her hopes on the stories of his legendary stubbornness. But stubbornness, she was learning, could cut both ways. Please, the word escaped as barely a whisper. I have nowhere else to go. No family, no friends who aren't too scared of Blackstone to help. You're the only one they can't buy or intimidate. Flattery won't work either, ma'am. Emily felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of this man who seemed carved from stone. What will work? What do you want? Jake's expression shifted, something almost like surprise crossing his weathered features. What I want is to be left alone. To work my land, tend my cattle, and not have to shoot anyone before breakfast. What I don't want is a war with Blackstone over water rights that probably aren't worth the blood they'll cost. They are worth it. Emily's voice gained strength, desperation giving way to determination. The water rights aren't just for the creek that runs through our property. They're for the underground spring that feeds half the valley. Samuel found documents in the old Spanish land grants that prove it. That's why they killed him. She reached into her saddle bag with trembling fingers, pulling out a leather portfolio tied with string. This is what they're really after. Not just my little ranch, but control of the water for the entire territory. With the railroad coming through, whoever controls the water controls everything. Jake's eyes fixed on the portfolio, and Emily saw the first crack in his stony facade. He knew, just as she did, that water was more precious than gold in this desert country. Men had killed for far less. Let me see it. He held out his hand, and Emily hesitated for just a moment before placing the portfolio in his palm. Their fingers brushed, and she felt the calluses from years of hard work, the faint tremor that spoke of old gunshot wounds. Jake untied the string and spread the documents across his palm, squinting in the fading light. Emily watched his face as he read, saw the moment when understanding dawned. His jaw tightened, and when he looked up at her, his expression had changed completely. "Son of a bitch," he muttered. "You know what this means." "It means whoever controls that spring controls the future of this territory," Emily said quietly. "And right now, according to those documents, I control it, which puts a target on your back the size of Texas." Jake carefully folded the documents and handed them back to her. "Blackstone won't stop until they have these papers, or you're dead, probably both." Emily tucked the portfolio back into her saddle bag, her hands steadier now. "That's why I need your protection. I can't fight them alone, but together. Together, we just make it easier for them to kill us both in one place." Jake turned toward his cabin, and Emily's heart sank. But instead of going inside, he whistled sharply. A moment later, a magnificent black stallion appeared from behind the building, already saddled. "What are you doing?" Emily asked. Jake swung onto his horse with fluid grace, settling into the saddle like he'd been born there. "You want my protection? Fine, but we're not making a stand here. Blackstone's got 20 men on their payroll and half the law enforcement in 3 counties in their pocket. If we're going to survive this, we're going to need more than good intentions and old Spanish documents." Emily stared up at him, hope and fear warring in her chest. "Where are we going?" Jake's smile was sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous to pay a visit to some old friends of mine. "See, Mrs. Preston, you're not the only one with secrets. And if Blackstone wants a war over water rights, they're about to discover they picked the wrong rancher to mess with." He held out his hand to her, and Emily realized this was her moment of choice. She could climb onto her exhausted horse and ride away, try to find safety in some distant town where Blackstone's reach didn't extend. Or she could take this dangerous man's hand and commit herself to a path that would likely end in blood and gunfire. Emily looked into Jake's eyes and saw something she hadn't expected. Not just strength, but honor. This was a man who, once committed, would never abandon her to face her enemies alone. She grasped his hand and let him pull her up behind him onto the stallion. The stallion's powerful strides carried them away from the cabin as darkness painted the desert in shades of purple and black. Emily held tight to Jake's waist, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing and the tension in his muscles. Behind them, the last light of day disappeared beyond the canyon walls, and ahead lay only uncertainty. "There's something you should know," Jake said over the wind. "Those friends I mentioned, they might not be as friendly as I remembered. Before Emily could ask what he meant, the sharp crack of rifle fire split the night air. Jake cursed and spurred the stallion faster as bullets whined past their heads. Emily looked back to see muzzle flashes erupting from the rocks they just passed. "Hold on," Jake shouted, leaning low over the horse's neck. The stallion stretched into a full gallop, hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth. More shots rang out closer this time, and Emily felt something tug at her torn dress. They rounded a bend in the canyon, and Jake pulled hard on the reins, bringing the stallion to a sliding stop behind a cluster of boulders. "Get down and stay low," he ordered, already dismounting with his rifle in hand. Emily slipped from the saddle, her legs shaking from adrenaline. "Who are they? Blackstone's men, maybe. Or maybe word travels faster than I thought." Jake checked his rifle's load and peered around the boulder. "Either way, they're between us and where we need to go." The sound of approaching hoof beats echoed through the canyon and voices carried on the still air. Emily caught fragments of conversation, saw them head this way. "Woman's got a bounty. Orders are to bring her back alive." Jake's expression darkened. "They want you alive, that's something at least, is it?" Emily whispered. "From what I know about Blackstone, sometimes dead is better." Another voice closer now and carrying the authority of command. "Mrs. Preston, we know you're out there. Mr. Blackstone wants to make you a reasonable offer. Come out now and nobody has to get hurt." Jake snorted softly. "Reasonable offer, that's rich." He turned to Emily, his face grim in the moonlight. "Here's the thing. They've got us outnumbered and outgunned. Fighting our way out isn't exactly a winning strategy." Emily's heart sank. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe you should consider their offer. Hear them out." The words hit Emily like a physical blow. She stared at Jake in disbelief, seeing the cold calculation in his eyes replace whatever warmth had been there before. "You're going to hand me over." "I'm saying I didn't sign up to die for a woman I met an hour ago." Jake's voice was flat, professional. "You came to me for protection, but protection has its limits. These aren't some two-bit cattle rustlers we're dealing with." Emily felt the familiar sting of betrayal, the same sensation she'd experienced when neighbors had turned their backs after Samuel's death. But this was worse because, for a brief moment, she had actually believed this man might be different. "Mrs. Preston," the voice called again. "We're waiting." Jake stood slowly, his rifle lowered. "She's here," he called back, "but I want to talk terms first." Emily's world seemed to tilt sideways. After everything, the 3-day ride, the desperate plea, the moment when she thought she'd found an ally, it was ending the same way it always did, with men calculating her worth and finding it wanting. "Smart man, Callahan," the voice replied. "Come on out, both of you. Let's discuss this like civilized people." Jake looked down at Emily, and for a moment she thought she saw something like regret flicker in his eyes. "Sometimes survival means making hard choices," he said quietly. "And sometimes it means choosing who you want to be when the bullets start flying." Emily shot back. She stood as well, squaring her shoulders. If she was going to face whatever Blackstone had planned for her, she'd do it with her dignity intact. They stepped out from behind the boulder together, and Emily counted 6 men arranged in a semicircle, all with weapons drawn but not quite aimed. The leader was a thin man in an expensive suit that looked ridiculous in the desert setting, his pale eyes fixed on Emily with undisguised satisfaction. "Mrs. Preston, you've led us quite a chase, Mr. Atris." Emily recognized Blackstone's chief enforcer, a man whose reputation for cruelty was matched only by his loyalty to his employer. "I can't say the pleasure is mutual." Hendrik smiled, revealing teeth that were too white and too sharp. "Mr. Blackstone is prepared to be quite generous. $10,000 for those documents you carry, plus safe passage to California. You could start over, make a new life for yourself, far from all this unpleasantness. And if I refuse, well, that would be unfortunate, but Mr. Blackstone is a practical man. He'll get those documents one way or another." Emily glanced at Jake, who stood silent and motionless beside her. His face gave away nothing, but she noticed his hand resting casually near his gun butt. Was he planning something or simply waiting to see which way the wind blew? "I need time to think about it," Emily said. Atris checked a gold pocket watch. "You have until sunrise. My men will escort you to our camp where you'll be quite comfortable while you consider Mr. Blackstone's generous offer." "And Callahan?" Mr. Callahan is free to go. This doesn't concern him. Emily felt Jake stiffen beside her. Something in Hendrick's tone suggested there was more to this than a simple business transaction. Unless, of course, he chooses to make it his concern, Atris continued. In which case, we'd be happy to extend Mr. Blackstone's hospitality to him as well. The threat was clear, and Emily saw Jake's jaw clench in response. For a moment, she thought he might draw on them right there. 6 against 1 wasn't good odds, but she'd heard stories of what Jake Callahan could do with a gun in his hand. Instead, Jake surprised her again. I think the lady needs more than a few hours to consider such an important decision. How about I escort her to your camp, make sure she's treated properly? Professional courtesy, one hired gun to another. Hendrick's smile widened. Of course. We've heard about your reputation, Mr. Callahan. It would be an honor to have you as our guest. As they mounted up for the ride to the Blackstone camp, Emily found herself pressed against Jake's back once again. But this time, instead of feeling protected, she felt like a prize being delivered to the highest bidder. Why? She whispered, her lips close to his ear. Jake was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low, only she could hear it. Because sometimes the only way to win is to let them think they've already won. Emily's breath caught. She studied the rigid line of his shoulders, the careful way he held himself in the saddle. Was this part of some larger plan, or was he simply trying to ease his conscience about handing her over? As they rode through the moonlit desert toward whatever fate awaited her in the Blackstone camp, Emily realized she was about to find out exactly what kind of man Jake Callahan truly was, and whether his answer would leave her speechless for all the wrong reasons. The Blackstone camp materialized from the darkness like something out of a fever dream. Canvas tents arranged in military precision around a central fire with armed guards posted at regular intervals. Emily counted at least 20 men, all wearing the kind of hard expressions that came from a lifetime of taking orders and asking no questions. Hendricks dismounted with the fluid grace of a man comfortable with violence. "Welcome to our humble camp, Mrs. Preston. I trust you'll find the accommodations adequate for your brief stay." Emily slid down from Jake's horse, her legs unsteady after the ride. The portfolio containing Samuel's documents felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds against her side. Around the fire, she could see faces turned in her direction. Some curious, others openly hostile. These weren't just hired guns. They were Blackstone's private army. "The lady will need her own tent," Jake said, his voice carrying an authority that surprised Emily. "And food. She's been riding hard for 3 days." "Of course," Hendricks gestured to one of his men. "Rodriguez, see that Mrs. Preston is made comfortable. Mr. Callahan, perhaps you join me for a drink. I believe we have much to discuss." Emily caught Jake's eye, searching for some sign of what he was planning, but his face remained an unreadable mask as he nodded to Hendricks. "Lead the way." As Emily was led to a small tent at the edge of the camp, she strained to hear the conversation between Jake and Atrix, but their voices were too low and the crackle of the fire drowned out their words. Rodriguez, a weathered Mexican with kind eyes, brought her water and heart attack. "Senora," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "You should know Senor Atris. He is not a patient man, and when he grows tired of waiting, what happens then?" Rodriguez shrugged, but his expression was grim. "He gets what he wants anyway, one way or another." Left alone in the tent, Emily tried to piece together Jake's plan if he had one. The man had shown no hesitation in turning her over to Blackstone's men, despite his earlier promises of protection. Maybe the stories about him were wrong. Maybe he was just another gun for hire, willing to switch sides when the odds turned against him. Outside, she could hear laughter and conversation around the fire. The sound made her feel more isolated than ever. Samuel would have known what to do. Her husband had always been the strategist, the one who thought 3 moves ahead while Emily focused on day-to-day survival. Now she was alone with decisions that could determine the fate of the entire valley. A shadow passed by the tent opening and Emily tensed, but it was only Rodriguez returning with a plate of beans and salted pork. As he set the food down, he leaned close enough to whisper, "Senor Callahan. He asked me to tell you something. He said to remember that sometimes the hunter must become the prey before he can spring his trap." Emily's pulse quickened. So Jake did have a plan, but what kind of trap could he spring with 20 armed men surrounding them? She forced herself to eat, knowing she would need her strength for whatever was coming. The beans were overcooked and the pork was tough, but it was the first real food she'd had in days. As she ate, she heard footsteps approaching the tent. "Mrs. Preston," Hendrick's voice was smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "I wonder if I might have a word." Emily sat down her plate and straightened her shoulders. "Of course." Atris entered the tent, his pale eyes taking in every detail of her appearance. Behind him stood two of his men, their hands resting casually on their gun butts. The message was clear. This conversation would go exactly as Atrix wanted it to go. "I hope you've had time to consider Mr. Blackstone's offer," he said, settling himself on a camp stool across from her. $10,000 is quite generous for a few old documents. "The documents are worth far more than that, and we both know it," Emily replied. "Control of the underground spring means control of the entire valley's water supply. With a railroad coming through, that's worth millions." Hendrick's smile was cold as winter moonlight. "Ah, but you're thinking like a landowner, Mrs. Preston. I'm thinking like a businessman. You see, those documents are only valuable if you're alive to authenticate them, and your continued health is, shall we say, dependent upon your cooperation." The threat was unmistakable. Emily felt her mouth go dry, but she forced herself to meet Hendrick's gaze steadily. "And if I refuse, then Mr. Blackstone will acquire the documents through other means. Unfortunately, such methods tend to be rather messy. Accidents happen, you understand. Fires, falls from horses, attacks by wild animals. The frontier can be quite dangerous for a woman traveling alone." Emily's hand instinctively moved toward the portfolio, and Hendricks noticed immediately. "Of course, we could simply take them now, but Mr. Blackstone prefers legal transactions when possible. A signed transfer of the water rights would be so much cleaner than forged documents. What about Jake Callahan? What's his role in all this?" Hendrick's expression darkened. "Mr. Callahan is a complication we hadn't anticipated. His reputation makes him useful in certain situations, but reputation can be a double-edged sword. Men with reputations sometimes develop inconvenient consciences. Is that what you're worried about? That he might develop a conscience?" "I'm worried about nothing, Mrs. Preston. Mr. Callahan is one man against 20. Whatever heroic notions he might be entertaining, the mathematics are quite simple." Emily heard voices outside growing louder, and Atrix turned toward the sound with a frown. Suddenly, Jake's voice cut through the night air, clear and caring. "Atrix, we need to talk now." Atrix stood, his hand moving to his gun. "Wait here," he ordered Emily, then stepped outside. Emily crept to the tent opening and peered out carefully. Jake stood in the center of the camp, illuminated by the fire light. But something was different about him. Gone was the cautious neutrality he'd shown earlier. His stance was relaxed but ready, his hand hanging loose near his gun. This was the Jake Callahan of legend, the man who'd faced down 10 gunfighters in Dodge City and lived to tell about it. "You have something to say, Callahan," Hendricks called out. "I do." Jake's voice carried easily across the camp. "See, I've been thinking about Mrs. Preston's situation, and I've decided I don't much like the terms of your employer's offer." Emily's heart hammered against her ribs. Around the camp, she could see Blackstone's men shifting position, hands moving toward weapons. They were seconds away from a bloodbath, and Jake was deliberately putting himself at the center of it. "That's unfortunate," Hendricks said, "but as I mentioned earlier, this doesn't really concern you." Jake smiled, and Emily felt a chill run down her spine. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "That's where you're wrong, Atrix. You see, there's something about this situation that nobody's mentioned yet. Something that changes everything. And what might that be?" Jake reached slowly into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "A marriage certificate dated this morning. Turns out Mrs. Preston and I had a private ceremony before we rode out here." Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Around the camp, men began muttering among themselves. Hendrick's face had gone white as bone. "You're lying," he snarled. "Am I?" "Rodriguez, you witnessed the ceremony, didn't you?" The Mexican nodded gravely. "See, Senator Callahan, Father Miguel performed the service at dawn. Very romantic, very legal." Emily realized with shock that Rodriguez wasn't one of Blackstone's men at all. He was working with Jake. But how? When had they planned this? Hendricks' hand hovered over his gun. Even if that's true, it doesn't change anything. Mr. Blackstone still wants those documents. But it changes who he has to deal with to get them, Jake said quietly. Because under territorial law, those water rights now belong to both of us, and I'm not nearly as reasonable as my wife. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant cry of a coyote. Emily watched in fascination as understanding dawned on Hendricks's face. Jake hadn't just married her to protect her. He'd married her to claim joint ownership of the most valuable water rights in the territory. "You son of a bitch," Atris breathed. Jake's smile widened. "Now here's what's going to happen. My wife and I are going to ride out of here, and you're going to let us go because if anything happens to either of us, those documents go straight to the territorial governor. And I don't think Mr. Blackstone wants that kind of attention." Emily could see the calculation in Hendrick's eyes. Jake was right about the mathematics, but not the way he'd meant earlier. This wasn't about guns and bullets anymore. This was about politics and legal complications that could tie up Blackstone's plans for years. "You've made a very dangerous enemy tonight, Callahan," Hendricks said finally. "Wouldn't be the first time," Jake replied. "Now if you'll excuse us, my wife and I have a honeymoon to get to." As Jake helped Emily onto his horse, she whispered, "When did you plan all this?" His answer left her absolutely speechless. "I didn't. Sometimes you just have to trust that the right answer will come when you need it most." They rode hard through the night, the stallion's hooves pounding against the desert floor as Emily clung to Jake's waist. Behind them, she could hear the sounds of the camp stirring to life, shouted orders, horses being saddled, the preparation for pursuit. But Jake seemed to know exactly where he was going, guiding them through a maze of arroyos and hidden canyons that would make following their trail nearly impossible. "There's a line shack about 5 miles north," Jake called over his shoulder. "We can hold up there until morning, figure out our next move." Emily's mind reeled with everything that had happened. The marriage certificate. Was it real? Had Jake actually planned this elaborate deception, or was he improvising as he went? And Rodriguez, how had Jake managed to turn one of Blackstone's own men? The line shack appeared just as the eastern sky began to lighten with the promise of dawn. It was a simple structure built into the side of a rock formation that provided natural camouflage. Jake dismounted and helped Emily down, his hands lingering on her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. "We should be safe here for a few hours," he said, leading the stallion to a small corral hidden behind the rocks. "Hendricks won't want to split his forces to search every canyon, and this place isn't on any maps." Emily watched him tend to the horse with practiced efficiency. In the growing light, she could see the lines of fatigue around his eyes, the tension in his shoulders that spoke of a man carrying more than his share of secrets. "Jake," she said quietly, "that marriage certificate, was it real?" He paused in his work, his back still turned to her. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me." Jake turned around slowly, and Emily saw something vulnerable in his expression. "Rodriguez isn't just a hired gun. He's my brother-in-law. My sister Maria married him 5 years ago, and when Blackstone started muscling in on small ranchers, Rodriguez hired on with them to gather intelligence." Emily felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "He's been spying for us. There's a network of ranchers and farmers who have been fighting Blackstone's expansion for months. We've been waiting for the right moment to move against them, but we needed proof of their illegal activities. When Rodriguez heard about your documents, you saw an opportunity." Emily wasn't sure whether to feel grateful or used. "So, the marriage certificate." Jake reached into his vest and pulled out the folded paper, holding it out to her. Emily unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the formal language. At the bottom in flowing script were 2 signatures, Jacob Callahan and Emily Preston Callahan. "It's real," she breathed. "Father Miguel is Rodriguez's uncle. He performed the ceremony this morning while you were sleeping. Rodriguez and 2 of his cousins witnessed it." Jake's voice was matter-of-fact, but Emily could see the uncertainty in his eyes. Under territorial law, it's completely legal and binding. Emily stared at the document in her hands. She was married to a man she'd met less than 24 hours ago. A man who'd made one of the most important decisions of her life without consulting her. You should have asked me, she said finally. Would you have said yes? The question hung in the air between them. Emily thought about her desperate ride to his cabin, her plea for protection, the way her heart had hammered when she thought he was going to abandon her to a tryst. Would she have agreed to marry him, even knowing it was a business arrangement designed to protect her water rights? I don't know, she admitted, but I should have had the choice. Jake nodded slowly. You're right. I made a decision that affected both our lives, and I didn't give you a say in it. If you want, we can have it annulled when this is all over. Before Emily could respond, the sound of approaching horses drifted through the morning air. Jake was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, motioning for Emily to get inside the lined shack. Through the single window, she could see 3 riders approaching at a leisurely pace. It's all right, Jake said, lowering his weapon. That's Tom Crawford and his boys. They're part of our network. The 3 men who dismounted were clearly ranchers. Weathered, practical, with a kind of steady confidence that came from years of hard work and honest dealing. The leader, a grizzled man with a steel-gray hair, grinned as he approached. Jake, you old dog, Rodriguez sent word that you tied the knot. Congratulations. Emily stepped outside as Jake made introductions. Tom Crawford owned the largest spread in the eastern part of the valley. His sons, Jim and Peter, were cut from the same cloth, honest men who'd been fighting Blackstone's encroachment for months. Ma'am, Tom said, touching his hat brim respectfully. Welcome to the family, so to speak. Any enemy of Blackstone's is a friend of ours. Thank you, Emily said, still processing the reality of her situation. Jake tells me you've been fighting them for some time. Fighting and losing, Jim said grimly. They've got the law bought and paid for and enough guns to back up their claims. We've been waiting for something to tip the scales in our favor. And now we've got it, Jake said, his voice gaining strength. Emily's documents prove that Blackstone has been filing fraudulent water claims all across the territory. With that evidence in the backing of the legitimate land owners, we can take this to the territorial governor. Tom nodded, but his expression remained troubled. Problem is getting those documents to Santa Fe alive. Blackstone's got people watching every road, every town, and after last night they know exactly what you're carrying. What are you suggesting? Emily asked. We split up, Peter said. Create multiple targets, make it harder for them to track the real documents. Some of us head north toward Santa Fe, others go east toward the railroad depot at Cedar Falls. Keep them guessing. Emily felt a chill of foreboding. And if they catch the group carrying the real documents, then we all die for nothing, Jim said bluntly. But if we do nothing, we die anyway. At least this way we've got a fighting chance. Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying the horizon where dusk clouds marked the movement of distant riders. There's another option, he said finally. We could destroy the documents. Everyone stared at him. Emily felt her heart stop. What? Think about it. Jake continued. Blackstone wants those documents because they prove his claims are fraudulent. But if the documents are destroyed, his claims are still fraudulent. They just can't be proven in court. However, the Territorial Survey Office in Santa Fe has copies of all the original Spanish land grants. If we can get there and request an official survey of the water rights, the survey would reveal the same information. Emily finished, understanding dawning. But Blackstone couldn't simply steal or destroy an official government survey. Tom was nodding slowly. It's risky. Without the documents as proof, we'd be betting everything on the government doing the right thing. As opposed to betting everything on outgunning Blackstone's army, Jake asked. At least this way, Emily doesn't have to carry a target on her back. Emily looked around at the faces of these men who were willing to risk everything for a principle. They could scatter to the winds, abandon their homes, and start over somewhere else. Instead, they were choosing to fight for what was theirs. There's something else to consider, she said quietly. Even if we get an official survey, Blackstone still has 20 armed men and a clear's throat willingness to use them. Legal victories don't mean much if you're not alive to enjoy them, which is why we need to cut off the head of the snake, Jake said. Blackstone himself. He's supposed to arrive from Denver next week to oversee the final phase of his land grab, if we can get to him before he gets to us. You're talking about assassination, Tom said. I'm talking about justice, Jake replied. This man has murdered innocent ranchers, stolen their land, and corrupted the legal system. Sometimes justice comes from the barrel of a gun. Emily studied her new husband's face, seeing the hard determination there. This was the man who'd built his reputation with violence, who'd survived by being faster and more ruthless than his enemies. But she also saw something else, a deep weariness, as if he was tired of solving problems with bullets. What if there was another way, she asked. What if we could force Blackstone to reveal his own crimes? Jake raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Emily smiled for the first time since arriving at Jake's cabin. What if the hunter became the prey just like you said? What if we let Blackstone think he's won and then used his own arrogance against him? As she outlined her plan, Emily saw respect growing in the eyes of the men around her. It was dangerous, requiring precise timing and no small amount of luck. But if it worked, they wouldn't just defeat Blackstone. They'd destroy him completely. Mrs. Callahan, Tom said when she finished, I think your husband married a dangerous woman. Jake's smile was proud and a little bit wicked. That's exactly what I was hoping for. The trap was set with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. 3 days had passed since the meeting at the Line Shack, and now Emily stood in the dusty main street of Cedar Falls, watching the noon stage roll to a stop in front of the hotel. Right on schedule, Marcus Blackstone stepped down from the coach. Resplendent in his tailored suit and polished boots, every inch the successful businessman come to survey his growing empire. Emily adjusted the veil covering her face and smoothed the black dress she'd borrowed from Tom Crawford's wife. To anyone watching, she appeared to be just another widow waiting for the stage. But beneath the mourning clothes, she carried Jake's spare revolver and enough determination to see this through to the end. Blackstone was exactly as she'd imagined, tall, distinguished, with silver hair, and the kind of confident bearing that came from a lifetime of getting what he wanted. He moved through the small crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands and making pleasant conversation, while his eyes constantly assessed, cataloged, and calculated the value of everything around him. Atris appeared at his employer's elbow, and Emily saw him lean close to whisper urgently in Blackstone's ear. The older man's expression didn't change, but his gaze sharpened as he scanned the street. Emily turned away, pulling her veil lower, and walked toward the hotel at an unhurried pace. She had to time this perfectly, too early, and Blackstone would have time to escape. Too late, and Jake and the others would be caught in the open when the shooting started because there would be shooting. Emily had no illusions about that. Men like Blackstone didn't give up their fortunes without a fight. Inside the hotel, she positioned herself in the lobby where she could watch the front entrance. Through the window, she could see Jake across the street, lounging in front of the saloon with the casual ease of a man who belonged there. Tom Crawford and his sons were stationed at the livery stable, while Rodriguez had positioned himself on the hotel's second floor with a rifle. At exactly 12:30, Blackstone entered the hotel with Atrix and 2 bodyguards. Emily rose from her chair and approached the front desk, timing her movement so that she would arrive just as Blackstone finished checking in. "Excuse me," she said, her voice pitched to carry just far enough. "Are you Mr. Marcus Blackstone?" Blackstone turned, his practiced smile already in place. "I am indeed, madam. How may I be of service?" Emily lifted her veil, revealing her face for the first time. The effect was immediate and electric. Blackstone's smile froze. Atrix cursed under his breath, and both bodyguards reached for their weapons. "I believe we have some business to discuss," Emily said calmly. "About water rights and fraudulent land claims. Mrs. Preston." Blackstone's voice was smooth as silk, but Emily could see the calculation behind his eyes. "Or should I say, Mrs. Callahan? Yes, we heard about your hasty marriage. Quite romantic, really." "Romance had nothing to do with it," Emily replied. "This is purely business. You want my water rights, and I want you to stop murdering my neighbors." Blackstone gestured toward the hotel's dining room. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more private." Emily nodded and allowed herself to be escorted to a corner table, very aware of the bodyguards flanking them and Atrix positioning himself near the door. She was now completely surrounded by enemies, exactly as planned. "You've caused me considerable inconvenience, Mrs. Callahan," Blackstone said once they were seated. "My associates tell me you're quite resourceful. I respect that in a businesswoman. Thank you. I've learned a great deal about business since my husband's murder. Regrettable, but sometimes progress requires difficult decisions. Blackstone's casual dismissal of Samuel's death sent rage coursing through Emily's veins, but she kept her expression neutral. However, I'm prepared to be generous. $50,000 for your water rights and safe passage to anywhere you'd like to go. $50,000. Emily raised an eyebrow. That's quite an increase from Atrix's original offer of 10. Clear as throat, I'm a practical man, Mrs. Callahan. I recognize value when I see it. Emily leaned back in her chair, playing her part perfectly. And what about my husband? Does the offer include him? Blackstone's smile turned predatory. I'm afraid Mr. Callahan has made that rather difficult. His reputation complicates things considerably. However, if he were to suffer an unfortunate accident while protecting his new bride from road agents, you'd kill him. I'd mourn his passing along with everyone else in the territory. Such a shame when a good man falls victim to the lawless elements that plague our frontier. Emily felt sick to her stomach, but she forced herself to nod thoughtfully. I see. And you believe you can arrange such an accident. My dear woman, I can arrange anything. The question is whether you're wise enough to accept my offer before circumstances force me to pursue less pleasant alternatives. This was it. The moment when Blackstone would reveal the full extent of his crimes. Emily could see Jake through the window, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. Rodriguez would be listening from upstairs, the conversation carrying clearly through the hotel's thin walls. Before I agree to anything, Emily said, I'd like to know exactly what I'm dealing with. How many people have you killed to build your empire, Mr. Blackstone? Blackstone chuckled, the sound devoid of any real humor. Killed. Such a crude word. I prefer to think of it as clearing obstacles to progress. The Hendersons, for instance, they were quite stubborn about their water rights until that unfortunate fire. And the Martinez family simply couldn't be reasoned with until those bandits attacked their ranch. Emily felt each name like a knife to the heart. These weren't just business rivals to Blackstone. They were real people with families, dreams, and rights. People who had died for the crime of standing in his way. And my husband, Samuel Preston. Ah, yes. Poor Samuel discovered some discrepancies in the land office records. He was going to make quite a fuss about it. Atrix handled that situation with his usual efficiency. Emily's hand moved slowly toward her concealed weapon, but Atrix was already in motion. That's far enough, Mrs. Callahan. I think this conversation has gone on long enough. The dining room exploded into chaos. Emily threw herself sideways as Hendricks drew his gun. The bullet meant for her heart splintering the chair where she'd been sitting. She rolled behind an overturned table and came up with Jake's revolver in her hand, firing twice at the nearest bodyguard. The hotel's front window shattered as Jake dove through it, his rifle already spitting fire. Tom Crawford and his sons burst through the back entrance, catching Blackstone's men in a deadly crossfire. From upstairs, Rodriguez's rifle added its voice to the symphony of violence. Emily saw Blackstone scrambling toward the stairs, a small derringer in his hand. She rose from cover and fired, the bullet catching him in the shoulder and spinning him around. He fell heavily, the derringer skittering across the floor. It's over, Blackstone, Emily shouted over the gunfire. Half the territory heard you confess to murder. Blackstone looked up at her, blood seeping through his expensive suit, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. You planned this. You recorded everything. Emily smiled grimly. Sometimes the only way to catch a predator is to make yourself look like prey. The shooting stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Atrix lay dead near the door along with both bodyguards. Jake appeared at Emily's side, smoke still curling from his rifle barrel. You all right? He asked, his eyes scanning her for injuries. I'm fine, but we need to get Blackstone to a doctor. Dead men can't testify. Jake nodded and turned toward the crowd that was beginning to gather outside. Tom, get the sheriff and the doctor. We've got a confession to preserve. As they waited for help to arrive, Emily knelt beside the wounded man who had destroyed so many lives. Blackstone looked up at her with eyes full of hatred and grudging respect. You realize this won't end with me, he gasped. I have partners, investors, they'll come for you. Let them come, Emily replied. We'll be ready. Jake helped her to her feet, his arms sliding around her waist in a gesture that felt natural and right. Think they'll believe his confession? Emily looked around at the dozen witnesses who had heard every word of Blackstone's admission. I think we've got more than enough evidence to convince any jury in the territory. As the sheriff arrived and began taking statements, Emily realized that, for the first time since Samuel's death, she felt truly safe. Not because the danger was over. There would always be men like Blackstone who believed power gave them the right to take what they wanted. But because she was no longer facing that danger alone, Jake squeezed her hand gently. "So, Mrs. Callahan, what do we do now?" Emily smiled up at her husband, her real husband, she realized. Not just a name on a marriage certificate, but a true partner who had stood with her when it mattered most. "Now we go home," she said, "and we build something worth fighting for." 6 months later, Emily stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching the sun paint the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson. The valley had changed dramatically since Blackstone's trial and conviction. Where once there had been fear and uncertainty, now there was hope, and the sound of new construction echoing across the plains. Jake emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag and grinning at the sight of the survey team packing up their equipment near the creek. "Official word came through this morning," he called to her. "The territorial government has confirmed your water rights. Every acre, every drop, every claim your husband documented." Emily felt a familiar pang at the mention of Samuel, but it was softer now, more like remembrance than grief. He would have been proud to see justice finally served. "He would have been proud of you," Jake corrected, climbing the porch steps to join her. "Takes real courage to walk into a room full of killers and dare them to confess their crimes." Emily leaned against his solid warmth, still marveling at how natural it felt to be married to this man. Their relationship had evolved from necessity to partnership to something deeper that neither of them was quite ready to name, but it was real, built on shared danger and mutual respect. "Any word from Rodriguez?" she asked. "He and Maria are settling in nicely on the Crawford spread." Tom offered him a full partnership in exchange for his testimony against Blackstone's organization. Turns out Rodriguez kept detailed records of every illegal activity he witnessed. Emily smiled. The network of small ranchers that had formed to fight Blackstone was now thriving. With the threat removed and legitimate water rights confirmed, new families were moving into the valley every week. The railroad was still coming through, but now it would benefit everyone rather than just corporate interests. The school board met yesterday. Emily said they've officially approved plans for the new schoolhouse. Classes will start in the fall. Jake nodded approvingly. This valley is going to need educated people if it's going to grow the right way. Speaking of which, I got a letter from the territorial governor's office. They're offering me the position of territorial marshal. Emily turned to look at him in surprise. "Marshal, that's quite an honor." "It is. But it would mean traveling all over the territory, being away from home for weeks at a time." Jake's expression was carefully neutral. "I wanted to discuss it with you before giving them an answer." Emily studied her husband's face, seeing the conflict there. Part of him was tempted by the challenge and responsibility of the position, but she could also see his reluctance to leave the life they were building together. "What do you want to do?" she asked. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze sweeping across the valley that had become their home. "A year ago, I would have taken that job in a heartbeat. Law enforcement was all I knew, all I thought I was good for. But now I wake up every morning next to a woman who risked everything to protect what was right. I see families moving into the valley because they know they'll be safe here. I watch the sun set over land that belongs to people who will work it and care for it instead of just strip it bare for profit." Jake turned to face her fully. "This is where I belong, Emily. This is where we belong." Emily felt her heart swell with an emotion she was finally ready to acknowledge. "I love you, Jake Callahan." The words hung in the air between them, simple and honest and true. Jake's face transformed, the hard edges softening into something wondering and grateful. "I love you too, Emily Callahan, more than I thought I was capable of loving anyone." He kissed her then, gentle and thorough and full of promises for the future. When they broke apart, Emily could see their neighbors gathering for the weekly community meeting down by the creek. The sight filled her with satisfaction. This was what they had fought for, what Samuel had died for, a place where honest people could make honest livings without fear. "There's something else we need to discuss," Emily said, taking Jake's hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. "The doctor confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby." Jake's eyes widened, and for a moment he was completely speechless. Then he swept her into his arms, spinning her around the porch while she laughed. When he sat her down, his face was radiant with joy. "A baby," he repeated as if testing the words. "Our baby due in the spring," Emily said. "Perfect timing for a new beginning." Jake knelt down and placed his ear against her stomach, his large hands spanning her waist. "Hello in there, little one. Your mom and daddy have quite a story to tell you when you're old enough to hear it." Emily ran her fingers through his hair, thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she had been a desperate widow with nowhere to turn. Now she was a partner in a thriving ranch, a leader in a growing community, and the wife of a man who had proven that sometimes the most unlikely alliances became the strongest bonds. "Jake," she said softly, "do you ever regret it? The way we met, the circumstances of our marriage?" He stood and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the lines of her cheekbones. "Emily, if I could go back and change one single thing about how we came together, I wouldn't. Every moment of danger, every difficult choice, every leap of faith led us to this. To you carrying our child to this valley full of people who are free to build their own futures. How could I regret the path that brought me the greatest happiness I've ever known?" Emily felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "When I rode to your cabin that night, I thought I was looking for protection. I didn't realize I was looking for home." "You found both," Jake said, pressing his forehead against hers. "And you gave me something I'd stopped believing in. Hope for a future worth living." As the sun set over their valley, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Emily and Jake stood together on their porch, planning for the child who would grow up in a world they had helped create. A world where justice mattered more than profit. Where communities took care of their own and clear's throat. Where love could grow even from the most unlikely beginnings. In the distance, they could hear the sound of children playing near the creek. Their laughter carried on the evening breeze. Soon their own child would be part of that joyful noise, growing up surrounded by the kind of people who understood that some things were worth fighting for. "Jake," Emily said as they watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "Yes, thank you for not abandoning me that night." Jake smiled and pulled her close, his arms encircling both her and the new life growing within her. "Thank you for being brave enough to ask for help, and for showing me that sometimes the best answers come from the heart, not from the barrel of a gun." Emily leaned into his embrace, feeling truly safe for the first time since Samuel's death. She had whispered that she would do anything for protection. And Jake's answer, marriage, partnership, love, had indeed left her speechless. But now she had found her voice again, and she knew exactly what she wanted to say. "I choose this," she whispered against his chest. "I choose you, I choose us." Jake's arms tightened around her. "Forever, forever." As the desert wind carried their words across the valley, Emily knew that some stories didn't end with the defeat of the villain or the restoration of justice. The best stories, the ones worth telling, were about what came after, about people who chose to build something beautiful from the ashes of what had been destroyed. And their story was just beginning. The sound of children's laughter echoed across the valley as Emily Callahan stepped onto the porch of what had once been a simple cabin, but was now a sprawling ranch house. 5 years had transformed not just their home, but the entire territory. Where once there had been dust and desperation, now there were green fields, bustling towns, and the constant sound of progress. "Mama, Mama, look what I found." 4-year-old Samuel Callahan came running across the yard, his dark hair so like his father's, catching the morning sunlight. In his small fist, he clutched a piece of smooth river stone that sparkled with flecks of mica. Emily knelt down to examine his treasure, her hand instinctively moving to her rounded belly where their second child grew. "That's beautiful, sweetheart. Where did you find it?" "Down by the creek with Papa and Uncle Rodriguez. Papa says it's special because it came from the mountain where the water starts." Emily smiled, remembering how that very water had brought her and Jake together. The underground spring that had caused so much bloodshed was now the lifeblood of a thriving community. The railroad had indeed come through, but instead of enriching distant corporations, it brought prosperity to the families who had fought to protect their land. Jake appeared around the corner of the house, carrying their daughter Sarah on his shoulders. At 2 years old, she had Emily's green eyes and her father's fearless spirit. "Careful there, little bird," Jake said as Sarah leaned forward to grab at a butterfly. "Don't want you taking flight before you're ready." Emily watched her husband with their children and felt the same wonder she'd experienced every day for the past 5 years. This man, who had once been known throughout the territory as a dangerous loner, had become the most devoted father she could have imagined. His reputation with a gun had faded into legend, replaced by his reputation as a fair neighbor and trusted leader. "The town council meeting went well," Jake said, lifting Sarah down so she could chase her brother around the yard. "They've approved funding for the new church and the expansion of the school. Mrs. Henderson will be the new teacher. She just graduated from the teaching college in Denver." Emily nodded approvingly. Education had been one of her primary concerns as the valley developed. She wanted their children to grow up with opportunities that went far beyond what she and Jake had known. And the marshal position filled by Tom Crawford's oldest boy. Jim's got a good head on his shoulders and the respect of everyone in the county. He'll do fine. Emily was relieved. There had been talk of Jake taking on law enforcement duties again, but she preferred him here, building their future rather than chasing down the ghosts of other people's pasts. The valley was peaceful now, prosperous enough to discourage desperate men but not so wealthy as to attract the kind of greed that had brought Marcus Blackstone to power. Speaking of the future, Jake said, settling beside her on the porch swing he'd built the previous spring. "I got a letter from the territorial governor. Statehood is looking more likely every year. When it happens, they'll need good people in government positions. Are you interested?" Jake shrugged, his arms settling around her shoulders with familiar comfort. "Depends on what you think. Politics isn't exactly my natural calling, but I've learned a thing or two about fighting for what's right." Emily leaned into his warmth, watching their children play in the yard they'd made safe through courage and sacrifice. "I think you'd make an excellent representative for the common people. You understand what it means to work for what you have." "We understand," Jake corrected. "None of this would have happened without your courage that first night. When you rode to my cabin asking for help, you set in motion everything that came after." Emily thought about that desperate woman who had whispered she would do anything for protection. She could barely recognize herself in that memory. That woman had been defined by her losses, her fears, her need for someone else to save her. The woman she had become was defined by her choices, her strength, and her partnership with a man who had chosen to grow alongside her. "Rodgers and Maria are expecting again," she said, changing the subject to lighter matters. "That'll make 4 children for them." "And 3 for us soon," Jake said, his hand gentle on her belly. "This valley is going to be full of little ones who will never know what it was like to live in fear of men like Blackstone. That's the best legacy we could leave them." A rider appeared on the horizon and both Jake and Emily tensed for just a moment. Old habits from dangerous times. But as the figure drew closer, they recognized young Peter Crawford, Tom's youngest son, who had taken over mail delivery for the valley settlements. "Mr. and Mrs. Callahan," Peter called as he approached the house. "Got a letter for you from back east. Official looking." Emily accepted the envelope with curiosity. It was indeed official, bearing the seal of the United States Territorial Court. Inside was a formal document that took her a moment to understand. "What is it?" Jake asked, seeing her expression. "It's a pardon," Emily said wonderingly. "A full territorial pardon for you, signed by the governor himself. It says your past actions in service of justice and the protection of territorial citizens have earned you a clean slate." Jake stared at the document, his face cycling through surprise, relief, and something deeper. For years, he had carried the weight of his violent past, even though that violence had ultimately served justice. Now, officially and legally, that burden was lifted. "Does this change anything for you?" Emily asked softly. Jake folded the pardon carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "It changes everything and nothing. I'm still the same man who loves you and our children more than life itself. But now I can hold public office, serve on juries, help build this territory into a state without the shadow of my past hanging over everything." Emily smiled, thinking of how far they had both traveled from that first desperate night. "So, what's next, Mr. Callahan?" Jake's answer was interrupted by Samuel's excited shout. "Papa, Mama, come see. The baby horses are here." They hurried to the corral where Jake's prize mare had indeed given birth to twin colts during the night. The children pressed against the fence rails in wonder, watching the newborn struggle to their feet on unsteady legs. "Everything starts somewhere," Jake said quietly, his arm around Emily's waist as they watched new life take its first tentative steps. "Sometimes it starts with desperation, sometimes with hope. But if you're lucky, if you're very lucky, it starts with love." Emily looked around at everything they had built together. The thriving ranch, the growing family, the peaceful valley where their children would grow up free and safe. All of it had begun with a desperate woman's whispered plea and a lonely man's unexpected answer. "Yes," she said, her hand finding his. "If you're very lucky, it does." The desert wind whispered secrets across Monument Valley as our story draws to a close. But like all the best tales from the Wild West, this ending was really just a beginning. Emily Morrison, who became Emily Callahan in the space of a single desperate night, discovered that sometimes the most dangerous gamble is also the most rewarding one. When she whispered those words, "I'll do anything for protection," she thought she was offering a transaction. What she received instead was transformation. Jake Callahan's answer wasn't just surprising, it was life-changing. Marriage as protection became marriage as partnership, which became marriage as love. Sometimes the most powerful bonds are forged not in comfortable circumstances, but in the fire of shared danger and mutual respect. But this story reminds us of something deeper than romance. In a world where powerful men like Marcus Blackstone believed they could steal, kill, and corrupt their way to success, it was the alliance of ordinary people that ultimately triumphed. Emily didn't defeat Blackstone with her gun, though she certainly knew how to use one. She defeated him with her courage, her intelligence, and her refusal to let evil go unchallenged. Jake Callahan learned that true strength isn't about being the fastest gun or the most feared man in the territory. True strength is about choosing to stand with those who need protection, even when the odds seem impossible. His answer to Emily's desperate plea revealed not just his character, but his capacity for growth and love. The valley they fought to protect became more than just land and water rights. It became a symbol of what's possible when people refuse to let bullies win, when communities come together to defend what's right, and when love grows from the most unlikely soil. Emily and Jake's child would grow up in a world shaped by their parents' courage. A world where justice mattered more than profit, where neighbors looked out for each other, and where even the most desperate situations could lead to hope. The schoolhouse Emily helped plan would teach generations of children that some things are worth fighting for, and that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they stand together. As we leave them on their porch watching the sun set over their valley, we're reminded that the best protection isn't walls or guns or money. It's love, community, and the courage to do what's right, even when it's dangerous. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more tales from the American frontier. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to make a desperate choice that changed your life? And remember, sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the simplest question. Will you help me? Until next time, may your trails be smooth and your courage never fail. This is the Wild West, where legends are born and love conquers.